This is the Triad Podcast Network.
Hey everyone, coming to you right in the middle of summer. It is vacation season. A lot of folks traveling. What better way to spend your travels in the car, though, than by listening to a podcast, right? And so we're here. This is going to be as appropriate as it gets, because you might be listening to this while you're on the road traveling. And today, that is the central theme of our episode with our certified financial planner, Jennifer Johnson from Three Magnolias Financial Advisors in Winston-Salem. Jennifer, our last episode, we talked about the most likely things that people regret spending money on, big purchases.
Right.
We're talking about something different here, because this is a very large expense that we're talking today, but in most cases, people don't regret spending money on these types of things, right? We're talking about travel and experiences.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I couldn't help but talk about this today because, I think the regret with travel is really different than some of the things we talked about last time, right? We talked about, luxury items and extra homes and things like that people sometimes don't live up to the hype. I think travel is maybe in a different category because people often come, retirement is the number one goal that people seek someone like myself out for advice on. And usually travel is a part of that, right? It's very common that people want to travel more when they retire. I also just took a trip with our family too that made me think about this as well. And I think travel is something, it's a big financial commitment for people. I think it's often a regret, though, because I find it sometimes doesn't work out. And we can talk about why, if it doesn't work out exactly the way, people think. So it's a different kind of regret. It's more like FOMO or something like that. Did I use that term right? FOMO.
Yep. I think so. I feel like sometimes the literal meaning of that acronym gets lost, but I think in this case it applies.
Yeah.
So what do you mentioned that it's one of the more common things that people ask your advice on. Can you frame the context of that a little bit? What do people typically ask you when it comes to travel?
Yeah, I think a lot of times people have visions of you see like the stereotypical buy the RV. You're going to take all these road trips, or you're going to take river cruises, for that retired couple. I think a couple reasons that, it's something definitely you want to plan for. But a couple reasons why it's a challenge for people. I mean, one, I think some of these trips are tough, like physically, right? Like travel is difficult physically,
stressful
sometimes like I think some of like the big bucket list items, people will come in, maybe they're in their 50s and they're getting excited about retiring, and they maybe haven't traveled a lot, and so they have this vision of we're going to do all these things. We're going to hike Machu Picchu. We're going to go to Europe. We're going to go to Australia. And a lot of times people are targeting retirement around their mid 60s, right? So, so we're getting a little bit older. And, one thing we find a lot of times is people just physically, like they wait too late, right? They think we're going to travel when we retire, and we find, it's physically difficult. I mean, I mentioned our family just took a trip we took a European tour, which was new for us. We had not done that. It was a great tour. Would recommend it, but it was very active. We started in Rome and ended up in Paris over about 9 days, including some travel there and back. So they really kept you very active, hopping the whole time. You also have jet lag. It's a 10-hour flight roughly over there. It's a 6-hour time change. And then you're very active. And I think, I'm 46. So I was we were okay, doing that. And our children are younger. But I imagine at, 76, that would be pretty tough, I think. So I think that's one reason that people, the retirement travel conversation Maybe sometimes, and it's not always my place, in those conversations to say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Client, maybe have you really thought about what it would take, for you to get to Australia at age 72? But I think in this context of just educating people, I wish people knew that earlier, I guess, is what I'm trying to share.
Yeah, that's a good point. And so how often do people think about, when you're planning for retirement, right? You're trying to figure out, I mean, at its basic core principle is how much money do I need so that I
Right.
can live my life without having to earn income through work?
Right. Right.
And most people are probably considering, okay, well, am I going to have a mortgage? What are my normal expenses going
Yeah.
to be?
Yeah.
Who else might I have to care for? College, all the things that you
Mhm.
plan for in terms of your regular expenses. But do people factor in budgeting a vacation budget as well into their retirement? Is
Well,
that
I encourage them to. Like, so when I'm doing planning for folks, you're leading into exactly kind of how we have those conversations, right? When we set goals, we might say, okay, I'll ask something essentially like, what's important to you? And so they'll generally say, if they're in that 50 plus, like, we kind of want to live the way we do now. And I think sometimes they forget, without some guidance, to say, okay, well, what about travel? Because a lot of times people, because of their jobs, right, we have limited time that we can take off. Usually it's not in the budget now to do the trips they want. So, well, do you envision traveling? So I usually will ask them that, which leads to some of those things I mentioned earlier. If we would love to go to Australia. We would love to travel and see all the national parks and things like that. And so like logistically, I guess, like, so when we think about planning, I'll usually factor in kind of a basic retirement living expense, extra for healthcare, which is like another conversation, of course. But and then we'll say, okay, let's, if we really want to travel, if it's really important to us, let's see what more we need to add. Is that an international trip every other year? Is it, more domestic travel? And so we'll factor it in like that. Does that make sense?
it
Kind of how
does?
I would approach it.
Yes, it does. And that's where that kind of starts, because if you don't ask the question of, well, what's important to you in retirement, people may not even the topic of
Yeah,
travel may never come up. And
that's
so
right.
yeah,
That's right.
so um let me ask this, and if this is not something that's an easy answer, we can cut it out or skip it.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
I remember when we took a trip, when my family and I took our first big trip to Disney. I know how much money we spent on that trip.
Yeah. Sure.
We drove,
Shocking.
so we drove, so it wasn't as
Yeah.
expensive as maybe it could have been if we flew. But
Right.
we did the Disney resort, we did multiple parks, the whole nine yards,
Oh yeah. We've
and
done
we
it.
knew how much that spent. And I
Yeah.
thinking to myself, how how do these people afford to do this every year? Because there are
Hmm.
people that do Disney every year, or
Yeah.
come up with
Yeah.
your other big destination location every year, whether it's,
Right.
it could be an international trip, could be Disney, whatever.
Right.
How
Right.
much, how much should people be thinking about when it comes to a big trip, week long destination location? Um, how much should people be thinking about to say, like, all right, if I'm figuring out annually what I need to have available for me and my significant other or whoever's with you in retirement, how much should I be thinking about when it comes to travel? Is there a number that you recommend, or is it really hard to come up with
It,
something?
it varies, but I will say, I think if you're thinking about a couple typically, right, in retirement, usually we hope our kids are independent at that point. So you're usually thinking like probably two people. If you're thinking like an international trip, I mean, I think you have to plan for at least 10,000, right? Probably more like 15,000. And so we'll use that as kind of an item. Sometimes people have traveled some, and like, so like in your case, you have that Disney experience, right, to kind of draw from. We know it was X dollars. And some people are Disney people, like you said, like they want to go to Disney every year, like
Hmm.
that becomes part of their goal. And so you just kind of have to sort of figure that out. I think that's one reason. When you prepare for retirement, there's a lot of sort of online calculators and things, and those certainly have their place, but they will not do that sort of discovery that, working with an advisor that really draws those questions out of you that maybe you haven't thought of. I think that's really the role of a good planner that you would work with. It's things from their experience of working with retirees now that, you're like, remember, we need to think about, if people have come in and they've used a calculator that says, okay, if you're making 100 grand a year, you need 80% of that in retirement. You might say, well, remember, what about healthcare? What about you're not, travel? We don't have that really in there. And really kind of pull from that and say, well, tell me where you like to go. Tell me, what does that look like? Because travel is like a lot of things. Like it could be they're just beach people, and they go and they just lay on the beach, so it's really quite affordable to people that take like really exotic, vacations. And so that if that helps kind of understand, I think it's so individualized, but it's something that definitely can be drawn out, and I think should be, or else I think it leads to some disappointment. That's where I'm probably trying to get to with the regret, is that if we really haven't planned for that, it can be a real disappointment, because I think that is one of the top things people think about when they think about retiring. It's not just not working, right? I mean, I think part of it is like, some people golf and things like that, but I think travel is usually way up there for most people.
Yeah, yeah. So, we're not talking about the money that people spend on travel as something that they regret. When we use the word regret in this conversation, we're talking about regretting that you didn't plan accordingly
Yeah,
for this travel. So, if you were to
right.
boil it down to a couple of key pieces of advice or tips to avoid that type of regret, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I think one, where you're headed, Adam, is I think you've got to really quantify, what sort of retirement do you want to be, what sort of travel do you want to be doing in retirement? And then I think you've got to be realistic about the physical abilities that you have at different ages, right? I kind of started with that. I maybe should have waited and ended with that, but as we get older, some of this travel is very physically difficult. And so one of the regrets that people often retirees share, is that they wish they had traveled earlier, right? And so that's maybe not exactly a retirement planning conversation, but it may be trips need to be taken, while you're working. I think that does a couple things. One, it becomes not something you have to save for necessarily as much in retirement. Maybe it's something you budget for, while you're still working. So it can be a little bit of financial relief. But you've got to kind of be realistic about those costs. Things are, and I think what you're alluding to earlier, Adam, too, like travel is often, more expensive, right, than what we think. I mean, when you were planning for Disney, if you don't mind me asking, did you think it would be as expensive as what it ultimately ended up being?
No, no,
Yeah,
because if you haven't done it before, it was so hard for me to project like food,
I know.
meals,
Yeah,
things you're buying to remember the trip. Um,
right.
I mean, you go and
Yeah,
if you
yeah,
spend a day at the pool, in between days at the park, and you're ordering food and you're
right.
ordering, the bottomless souvenir soda cups and all that stuff, and it's just
Right.
before you know it, you're spending, a few $100s that you hadn't thought
Sure,
of initially.
sure.
So yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's always that one in particular, but I know now that it's just hard to project, and so I have to go into it really building myself a nice little cushion over what I've projected.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think it's never cheaper than what we think, right? I mean, so I think that's consistent across most travel types, right? Unless you really are someone that just rents a place and you live there and cook your meals, and you just kind of relax, which is okay. I think that's a little maybe easier to plan for, and certainly physically less demanding. But I think be realistic, I
Yeah.
guess, would be another thing I would share.
Shout out to the people that do cook their own meals when they're on vacation. That is, we do that sometimes. That is not what I prefer because look,
Right.
just because my kids are little,
Yeah.
we spend a lot of energy uh in doing stuff outside on the if we're out on the beach, it is not relaxing with little
Right.
kids, that. And
Right.
so
You're
like the
hurting them,
the,
and
the
yeah.
last thing I want to do after a long day of the beach of corralling them and playing games and all sorts of stuff is then have to work to cook dinner for the family.
Right.
And it's just
Yeah.
like, no, let's just go out or order pizza or something. Like let's
Yeah.
actually have a moment of relaxation and ease in this long day of vacation.
That's
So
right. Yeah. Yeah. I think some of it is seasonal, right? Like when your kids are small, like things to do, that would change, as
yeah,
they get older. And certainly as we get older, I think some of it is just, if travel is important to you, then as we've talked before, you want to make sure you're acting in a way that's consistent with those values, right? So you may have to make some trade-offs, right? Like I think what you were asking too is like, how do people afford to do this every year? You'd like to think they're super frugal all year to like afford that, and that's just that important to them. I think unfortunately,
yeah,
like a lot of times people aren't, they're not saving for their retirement and maybe college in a way that we would like for them to. And maybe more money is going, toward, annual Disney trips in some cases. And I think that's something I'd be remiss if I didn't sort of warn people about that, if that makes sense.
yeah. So if people are like me, where you end up spending more than you originally planned for in certain areas, any resources you would offer to people in terms of maybe how to save a buck or two when they're traveling?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, certainly you can look at ways, to be frugal. I mean, eating out is a big one, right? I mean, if you can look at like hotels that have breakfasts included, are good. If you have the ability to prepare some food, that's always nice. We'll have a pretty good resource. I don't know that it's not ideal probably for families, but a link we can share about sort of how to travel and save money. I think it's probably geared more for that younger, like single person or a couple, because it has advice like, take a job on a cruise ship, things like that, that would give you those experiences. Teach English in another country, join tours, which is something we did. We did a tour group when we,
Hmm.
on our trip to make it more affordable and frankly easier to plan too. So there's some of those things I think you can do, and I think it may be something to, if people haven't been thoughtful about travel and that's something that's important to them, I don't think it's too early to start, if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the number one thing that I would say, not being an expert in money, but someone that has taken enough trips maybe to be knowledgeable about this, is that
Sure.
food is often the place where I
I
spend
know.
more than I should. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
we will typically, if we're staying in a hotel, I will always look for one that has a free hot breakfast in the morning,
Yeah.
because that takes care of one meal of the day. And if we don't stay in a place like that, we'll make sure that we bring just little things of cereal and
Right.
muffins and all sorts of stuff, because our kids are small, they don't eat a lot, so we don't need to
Right.
go
Right.
crazy on breakfast.
Yeah.
Sandwich stuff just to get you through lunch. Snacks, I mean, enough stuff where it's not you're not spending a ton of money at the store, and you can pack it in the car.
Yeah.
um and then if we do go to the beach if it's for a week, usually as soon as we get there and unpack everything, one of us will go and make a big run to the grocery store.
Yeah.
And that's one of the first things we do. So it's like that way we're not going and paying for food all over the place. And
Yeah. At least snacks and things, right?
yeah,
Like you don't want to do, cooking all your meals and that sort of thing. Because if you buy every snack, like you said, at the pool or at the convenience
Hmm.
places, it adds up. I think that's one of the budget busters, I think. And food has really gone up in price in the last few years, as we've discussed before.
Yeah. I was reading this article, and one of the things it talked about was, I'm paraphrasing here, but the philosophy was, you'll never reminisce about how much money you had in your bank account. And
Mm-hmm.
it was talking about, you know, take some opportunity to spend on travel and experiences and things that you will remember and have great photos and videos to share as you get older, and you'll talk about as families and things like that. And I'm curious your take on something like that, where it's, I don't think we're telling people to burn all of their money on experiences, because
Sure.
we talk all the time about emergency funds and retirement and saving
Right.
for your goals later in life. But where do you come down on the balance of, hey, take some liberties with the money that you've earned and spend a lot of time saving up to go and do the things that you'll remember later in life.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we mentioned in the last podcast about things people regret purchasing. I don't think any of those were experiences, right? They tended to be material things and things that required a lot of maintenance and follow up and work and ongoing cost. Travel's a little different, though. I do think it takes some planning, and I certainly want to share with folks. We don't want people to be irresponsible. What I would say is, I think you want to be really thoughtful about it, because it is expensive, right? I mean, it's like buying a used car, sometimes, so I think it's a purchase both before you retire, and then I would say definitely continuing to plan for in retirement is something, you want to be thoughtful about. And if that's an important financial goal for you, one thing that I help people do is to say, okay, if you want to travel in retirement, we need to save X dollars now, right? And so that helps them, I think, understand, these are the trade-offs, right? And then you can talk about ways you can do that. And I think also, folks want to be thoughtful about, things that they need to do now, things that they're going to physically need to do before retirement or when they're younger, and plan for that, really. I mean, not defer that, because that is a regret, like you said. It's a different type, right? It's a type where, later in life, you don't want to be sitting around. Certainly, you don't want to run out of money, but you also don't want to be sitting there, having saved for something that you can't physically do. You don't want to, not save enough and then realize, hey, I just didn't save enough, so now I'm retired, but I have to sit around and regret that I can't afford to take those trips. So I think it's the kind of thing you really need to be thoughtful about, and something certainly that we can help people plan ahead for, because I think that's really hard on their own. I think it's, as I mentioned before, like, not to take anything away from like rules of thumb or calculators, but I just don't think it really factors in some of these really personal goals. And I do think it's important. And one of the quotes that I ran across in kind of organizing my thoughts about this was, travel is the only thing you buy that makes you richer, which I thought was a very interesting quote. No, I would give somebody credit, but there was no known author of that statement. But it really struck me, because I do think it changes people. And, you certainly want people to, what I would say is, you have limited resources like time and money, right? You want to make sure you're using those
Yeah.
in a way that's most effective. Like you said, it's rarely is it the goal to die with X dollars in the bank, right? It's generally about creating the lifestyle that you envision now and retirement are most of the conversations, that I have with people.
That is a good quote. And I also think I'll take away what you said, which is, you don't want to necessarily be spending all this time saving for something that you can't physically do when you're at the retirement age.
Yeah.
I mean, bucket list things can oftentimes require you to exert some physical effort, whether it's hiking or climbing or whatever, or just walking or taking long days of tours around Europe. I mean, you've got to be physically able to do those things.
Yeah, I think so. And the jet lag and just the flying on little planes or little seats in big planes, it's physically hard. So you don't want to postpone that until you're not able to do it. Like I personally went back to how we plan for that. Well, generally you only plan for that kind of travel for some finite period, because usually I find people as they get later in their 70s, certainly into their 80s, people are not traveling at that point. It becomes maybe more about healthcare as they get later in life. So we sort of transition the planning, or have stages to the planning of things that we're looking to spend money for, just an experience and having done that. But I hope people travel. I think it's a great thing. I hope that we just, plan for it, budget for it now and budget for it when you retire, if it's something you want to be doing at that stage of the game, and, build out that travel plan, just like we would plan our other things in our life.
And there aren't a lot of hard and fast rules when it comes to the way we talk about other people's travel, but I think we would agree that don't budget for it with your credit cards is a good theme.
Yeah. You don't want to be paying for it with a credit card. Like you said it really well. I mean, it just adds up, especially food and gas. And if you haven't, a lot of them will let you kind of prepay, you make payments. And so hopefully people are doing that, or putting money aside for that, because we've talked about the danger and with credit cards. And I think especially once you get on, you get on vacation, you get on the trip. I think we mentioned this last time with the Regrets podcast. People go off and buy cars and things and they're on vacation. You're kind of like euphoric, right? So you end up maybe making more purchases. So you want to be wary of that too.
Yeah. But you won't talk about with your family all the moments you spent in your new car. You'll talk about where that car took you potentially, whatever car it is, doesn't matter. Okay. So let's kind of summarize here toward the end of our conversation. What are some of the key themes and takeaways that you hope people will bring from this?
Yeah, I hope people will be thoughtful and really kind of hash out and develop some goals for them, especially if it includes travel. And I think those would be goals maybe that some things you're doing at different life stages, really plan those costs out, be realistic, and be willing to make some trade-offs, right? Be willing to sacrifice, maybe not doing all the things you see friends doing or other people doing. If travel's really important to you, you may need to make some sacrifices if that's worth it to you. So those would be the things. And I would say seek out guidance to. Certainly we're here to help folks. If they want some help planning for that, they can check us out on the website, Three Magnolias Financial Advisors, all spelled out.com. They can give us a call at 336-701-1600 here, and we can help them get started on that journey.
Yep. And we'll have the phone number, the website, and Jennifer's email address in the show notes. Makes it really easy. If you're listening on your phone, just punch the link in the show notes and you can reach Jennifer's office. So great conversation, Jennifer. Glad you got to experience a wonderful trip with your family, and thank you for helping others maybe get some insight to how they can have a similar experience at the point.
Yeah, very good. It was fun. Thank you so much.
Securities offered through Private Client Services, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through Three Magnolias Financial Advisors, located at 110 Oakwood Drive, Suite 480, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 27103. Three Magnolias Financial Advisors and Private Client Services are not affiliated. Private Client Services is under separate ownership from any other named entity. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy. All all economic and performance information is historical and not indicative of future results. The market indices discussed are unmanaged. Additional risks are associated with international investing, such as currency fluctuations, political and economic stability, and differences in accounting standards. The views depicted in this material are for information purposes only, and not necessarily those of private client services. They should not be considered specific advice or recommendations for any individual. Neither private client services nor any of its representatives may give legal or tax advice.
This is the Triad Podcast Network.